Okay, so good afternoon everybody. You're very welcome to the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion workshop here this afternoon. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, which is Professor Karen McCloskey. Karen McCloskey is Professor of Physiology in the School of Medicine, Dentistry, Biomedical Sciences at Queen's University Belfast and Deputy Director of the Patrick G. Johnston Centre for Cancer Research. Professor McCloskey has led equality programmes in academia for more than 10 years, proactively challenging structures, co-creating action plans and driving cultural change. She is Director of the Queen's Gender Initiative, a female-focused entity in Queen's University, enhancing the participation and progression of women in Queen's, and Academic Lead for Athena Swan, Advanced HE Charter for Gender Equality in Academia in Queen's. As Academic Lead for the Race Equality Charter in Queen's, she has implemented a new racial equality programme to support inclusion of Black, Asian and minority ethnic colleagues and students. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor McCloskey, who's going to talk to us about reflections on gender equality and experiences of the Athena Swan Charter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emer. And thank you for the opportunity to share some of our learnings in Queen's University on gender equality. Some of you may know that earlier this year, Queen's received an Athena Swan Institutional Gold Award for our achievements in gender equality. So that opening sentence was fewer than 20 words. It took a few seconds to say, but it represents 25 years of work. And our gender equality programme started back in 2000, before the inception of the Athena Swan Charter. And the story is that a group of senior women challenged the university of what was going to be done about gender equality. And this Lady Brenda McLoughlin, was on a recruitment panel for the incoming Vice-Chancellor. And one of the questions all candidates were asked was, if you're appointed, what will you do about gender inequality? And from there, the Queen's Gender Initiative was founded, and you've heard from Emer, that's a female-focused entity in the university that aims to advance the participation and the progression of women. And that's where our first action plan came from in gender equality. And when the Athena Swan Charter was established 5 years later, we became a founder member, and 2 years after that, we got our first institutional silver award. So that's quite a long time ago. And that was against, at that point, 7 years of work against that first action plan. So our approach has been to listen to our community and needs analysis, and to then create solutions in the form of actions. So we pilot, we evaluate, and then we embed our initiatives. Whether those are holistic mentoring programs, championing family leave, providing childcare on campus and enhancing that provision, prioritising well-being, different ways of working, including agile working, and visibility and voice. And we identified the barriers to the progression of women, and we just worked to dismantle those. And it was so important to amplify visibility and voice, so we commissioned portraits. And the walls of Queen's changed from having only one woman pictured in our Great Hall, that was a Queen Victoria who founded the college back at the beginning, to commissioning portraits of many prominent women across university life. And as we changed the walls of Queen's, our culture also started to change, and visibility and voice is now taken on by many groups across Queen's, across gender, across race, and across other underrepresented groups. Briefly, 3 sustained approaches underpinned our GOLD programme, which, as I said, has been 25 years of work. The first is data, evidence-based actions, and measure the outcomes. But building an evidence base of data, certainly in Queen's, was really challenging. Data's held in pockets all across the university. Those systems are disconnected, but yet it's worth doing, because data makes the invisible visible. And it motivates all of us and our colleagues to become change makers. So in addition to data, we found that synergising a central programme with local programmes was really important. So I have a picture of the Aviva Stadium. How can a university, in our case 25,000 students, 4,500 members of staff, one action plan that sits in the middle, how can that impact all of our 15 schools? So we learned that having a complementary series of programmes within our schools was absolutely critical, because the issues in STEM, where women were underrepresented, were very different in social sciences and in nursing and midwifery, where men are underrepresented. So we set up Athena Swan programmes in each of our schools with a champion leading those. And those champions come together in a network every 6 weeks. They share practice, they find solutions together to challenges, and then we escalate up to the institutional committees. And we celebrate the success of our schools. They have now 3 gold, 7 silver, and 5 bronze. These are their milestones of success, and these are sources of pride for the students and staff. And sometimes they have fun as well. And if you don't have one of these large Jengas, I strongly recommend it. You can do so much with those. As we think about holding together progress in gender equality, connection is really important. And that Swan Champions network is complemented by other networks, whether it's our carers, where we care for our carers and parents and bring people together who have challenges, both within working life and the balance with family life. Having the glue of networks holding programmes together makes them effective. We talk, we do a lot of talking, and we do a lot of listening. And we've learned conversations crystallise solutions, whether in the moment or to develop a new programme for later. We've launched some new policies, and those new policies show how we've listened to staff, and these have been well received. So those policies address phases of life, challenges of navigating work, caring, and the rhythms of everyday life. So our recent work on menopause and fertility treatment provides support to women and non-binary staff, and importantly, they've normalised the conversations. These topics were taboo before we started, saying this is important to us. More than half of our staff are women, and we really want to be able to do something that gives additional support. And people sense the change. Our postdocs said, we need better information on maternity leave, because our contracts sometimes are ending while we're on leave. So we got better information out there. And we have been equipping all of us with additional measures, whether it's active bystander training, imposter syndrome training, and the awareness of the biases that affect the research that we produce and our research teams. The framework is applicable across all areas of underrepresentation. And how do we know that our approach has been working? Well, remember the data slide. We measure everything. We measure qualitative and quantitative data. Back in 2000, when the Gender Initiative was formed, 11% of our professors were women. Today, that's 34%. It's better, but there's still a long way to go. And as we have EDI encompassing many areas of underrepresentation, it's the right time for our Research Culture Action Plan that Chris talked about earlier. So we're synergising all of those action plans, whether it's plans for addressing crises, and crises deepen inequalities. We were able to apply EDI approaches to the return to work. Everybody couldn't get into the lab at the same time, so who was allowed in? Well, everybody. Didn't matter who you were or who your funder was, you had equal access to lab support. And we also gave grants to researchers whose impact was really negative by the pandemic and the closing of labs. And now, the EDI lenses that we've handed out, people are using those, and they're looking across all areas of education and research. As we look to the future, we want to enable girls from underrepresented groups to access higher education if that's what they wish to do, and we're working with local schools. Across education, our students are absolutely wonderful. They tell us student services are great, but they want inclusion in the classroom, and they've been able to share with us how we can do that better. And as we think of team science, increasingly EDI principles are so helpful, and we run workshops with our researchers and enable that inclusion to be part of the conversation. So as I conclude, Queen's has changed. That 25-year-old initiative is going to transition into an institute later this year. So we're opening the Queen's Global Institute for Women's Leadership that will capture a lot of our gender equality programmes. And if I just finish with this photograph back in '86, graduation looked different. Not only was health and safety not a thing, you can see people standing just around the main hall there, but only 8 of the female graduates in this picture. That was a time when women were really not able to access higher education. So we've come a long way. And as we further advance fairness, kindness, enable people to bring their whole selves to work and to thrive. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. That was great. My next speaker now is Dr. Wendy McLoone. And Dr. Wendy McLoone is Acting Director of Research at Queen's University Belfast, with responsibility for the strategic direction and leadership of professional support services to improve the long-term quality of the university's research and research environment. Prior to this, Wendy held the role of the Head of Research Development, a cross-university role which provided leadership and support for the development and growth of the research portfolio. Previously, Wendy worked for Science Foundation Ireland, developing and successfully leading innovative strategies for funding, discovery and translational research. She also lectured in chemical engineering at Queen's for 8 years and was a process engineer for Eli Lilly. The title of Wendy's talk is EDI and Research Action Plan from Queen's University Belfast. Thank you, Wendy.
Thanks, good afternoon, everyone, and again, thank you for the opportunity to share with you some of the work that has been led by my colleague, Dr. Mani Naranjan, on equality, diversity and inclusion in Research Action Plan. Unfortunately, Mani wasn't able to join us today, so you've got me instead. So hopefully I'll be able to do his work justice. And this action plan is something that we have begun delivering last year, and we're probably about 1 year into the delivery of the 3-year plan. So just to provide a little bit of background and context to this work, and much of this very much dovetails with some of the things that Karen has already mentioned. Queen's is extremely committed to equality, diversity and inclusion, and this is demonstrated in our Equality Scheme Action Plan. It was initially a 5-year plan back in 2018, and just earlier this year we've now published a plan that runs out to 2029. We have a number of different policies, a number of different initiatives, and in particular the EDI policy, which was launched in 2020. But I guess noticeably we don't have anything that specifically looks at ED&I from a research lens. With that, however, there is growing expectations from the research community that we begin to look at some of the sector challenges around EDI. Again, much of this kind of dovetails with some of the things that both Roz and Chris mentioned earlier. When we look across the research landscape, in this case the UK, we see an increased focus and expectation by both government and funders around looking at some of these systematic failures in the system that were drawn out, for example, in the Research Culture Report. So it's in this context that then back in 2022, as an institution, we identified the need to develop an ED&I research action plan, very much seeking to embed equitable research practices in everything that we do. And as I mentioned, it was approved just last year, and we're now in the year 1 of implementation. So we structured the plan into 2 phases. The first was the pre-award phase, so that's all of the processes, documentation, initiatives that we deploy up to the point at which a researcher would submit their research application to a funder. And then phase 2, which we're doing some preliminary work on now, is around that post-award phase, so all to do with the project delivery and the outcomes and the outputs from that research activity. Some of the things that we looked at in that pre-award and over the last year has been our managed bid competitions. And for those of you who are maybe not familiar with that terminology, This is where, as an institution, we have to do some pre-selection of bids that would be submitted to the funder. And increasingly, particularly in the UK system, we are seeing our funders asking universities to manage the number of applications that are submitted to particular schemes. So we have to put in place processes to select a small number of applications. And importantly, these are often for very high profile, prestigious opportunities. So things like fellowship applications or large centre bids. So very significant for individuals in terms of us ensuring that the selection process is fair and equitable. Across the university, we have a number of different internal funding pots. Again, these are distributed to our researchers based on an application process and some sort of evaluation. So we wanted to look at those pots and how we made the decisions around who was allocated funding. So in this slide, I'm just going to show an example of some data that we collected. As Karen referred to earlier, collecting this data was not an easy task. And in and of itself, we identified a number of new things that we needed to do in terms of making this more straightforward and simple moving forward. The data that you see here is for our internal managed bid processes. We looked here at 6 different processes that run on an annual basis over a 3-year period. So quite a significant body of data that we were able to examine and draw some conclusions from. What you can see here, and I'm not going to go through the data in detail, but you can very clearly see that we got fewer applications to our managed bid competitions from underrepresented groups. We simply look at the male-female data. Male baseline is 48%, applications around 67%. In contrast, baseline data for females is 52%, but only 33% application rate from that particular cohort. And likewise, then if you move on to success rates, again, you can see a significant difference depending on various different characteristics. Importantly, and you can't see it in this data, intersectional candidates were particularly disadvantaged. And in fact, over this 3-year period and all of those managed bid processes, no female BM candidates were successful in advancing their application through to be submitted to the funder. So this in itself raises some concerns for us. This is managed bid data, but when we look at similar trends from our internal funding processes, similar conclusions can be drawn. So with that in mind, we then set about pulling together our action plan, and we have a detailed plan that we've made very visible across the university so that everyone is very clear around what our commitments are and what we're planning to do to address some of these issues and challenges that we identified. So first of all is around evaluation, so investigating what are the barriers. As I mentioned, data collection was challenging, so we've put a lot of quite simple things in place around our application form. So something as simple as collecting the staff number of an individual, which then allows us to be able to collect the data appropriately. We did a lot of consultation with the user community. Again, getting the feedback, as Karen had mentioned, is extremely important. So asking those researchers, what is it about our managed bid processes or our internal funding pots that doesn't work, that causes challenges for you in terms of participation? And that was really helpful in terms of shaping our future plans in this regard. Next area was around access, so enabling the equitable research, very much highlighting the fact that we have now committed to an EDI and research action plan, publicising that on our website, going to town halls, engaging through our faculty research committees, and really getting the message out that as an institution we are committed to this activity. We looked at how we communicated with our research base, and importantly, were we inadvertently excluding particular groupings around publicising opportunities, whether it's managed bid or internal funding pots. So we've taken a much more inclusive approach to that. We have monthly newsletters that go out across the entirety of the research population, by example. We have a much more enhanced intranet, again, ensuring that no groups, as far as possible, are excluded from the communication of these opportunities. We then look to embed inclusive practices in everything we do. So did a lot of equality screening of our documentation, of various policies that we have, again, ensuring that the language was appropriate and encouraging individuals to engage. As I mentioned, a lot of our processes involved panels, so decision making. So we wanted to ensure that the composition of those panels, for example, represent the diversity of the research community, and providing training to colleagues to ensure that they were making appropriate decisions around internal processes, etc. And then the final aspect was around mainstreaming, so working with our funders and with the broader community to ensure that we were staying ahead of the sector developments in this space, learning about best practice, because often the funders were telling us, and we were asked to complete information and application forms around how we embedded EDI principles into our processes. So we were learning from the sector as this area evolves. But equally, we wanted to give feedback to the funders about things that maybe they were doing that was not providing a level playing field and an equitable playing field for individuals to participate. So by way of example, sometimes funders had deadlines for call submission on a bank holiday in Northern Ireland, which was different from the rest of the UK. So we were making the funders aware of these very simple things that were causing challenges. And even things like school holidays in Northern Ireland are different from the UK. And again, that was causing barriers to engagement. So that's kind of the pre-award phase. It's very much still in progress. And we've still a lot has been achieved in the year, but we've a lot to do. Moving then to the post-award very briefly, one of the things that we've looked at here is around recruitment into research grants and research awards. Particularly, we've looked at our student population and cohorts of doctoral students, and looked at various checkpoints along that PGR journey. So looked at our admission and application stage, looked at the differentiation stage, which is a process our students have to go through approximately 12 months after they start their PhD study, and then looked at completion and began to look at data to see if we were seeing any trends by way of lower rates of completion for a particular grouping of individuals. Were there barriers to the admission process, again, for particular groups? We've collected some data, we are beginning to see some trends there, and now we want to look at why those are happening and what interventions we can put in place to begin to address some of those. We also then want to look at something slightly different around access to infrastructure. Again, all universities have core facilities and equipment, so what are the barriers to particular groups accessing that equipment around, for example, disabled colleagues? What do we need to do to ensure better access to certain equipment? And then the more broader sort of outputs and outcomes from our research projects around publications and other outputs, and then the broader parameters around career development and progression. Again, how do we build some EDI considerations into those processes? So again, just to conclude, where are we taking this next? We're very much delivering on phase 1 of the action plan. We have a number of KPIs against which we're measuring the success. So things like, are we seeing changes in the data around successes and applications to some of our schemes? What does our panel composition look like for some of our internal programs? Are we getting the right diversity? So very much trying to monitor what benefit are all these interventions having in terms of our progress here. And we want to very much maintain this as a living plan. This ecosystem is continually evolving, so we want to be dynamic and agile to respond to that. Next month, we have some externally delivered EDI training, which we're going to roll out to our researchers. Again, some of that will focus on that pre-award selection process. We've done some preliminary analysis around the PGR cohorts. What is some of that intersectional analysis? What will that tell us? And then, as I mentioned, looking at things like infrastructure access, publications, etc. With all that in mind, then we want to develop a phase 2 action plan to sit alongside phase 1, and then begin to deliver that over the next 3 years or so. So thank you very much, and I'll take any questions to get to the follow-up.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Our next speaker is Dr Thandiwe Hara. Dr Hara is the co-author of the Equity and Inclusivity in Research Funding Report, and she is leading the implementation of the report's recommendations at the University of Oxford and across the higher education sector. She is trained in public health and has significant experience in the implementation of strategic initiatives, evidence-based practice, partnership development, public engagement, and inclusive research and innovation. She was previously jointly appointed to the lead on regional innovation and engagement at the University of Oxford and as a strategy development executive at Ox LAP. She is also a non-executive director for citizen and community involvement at NHS Devon, where she chairs the Quality and Patient Experience Committee. She is a trustee for Plymouth and Devon Racial Equality Council, and she has previously served as Public Governor for University Hospitals Plymouth NHS Trust. The title of Dr Hara's talk is Equity and Inclusivity in Research Funding, Tackling Barriers to Change. Thank you, Tandy.
Thank you. So every time I have to present, I never have to worry about, can you hear me? Because I think I can talk for the whole world, but can you see me? Because I'm that tiny. If you can't see me, you're going to have to stand up, I'm afraid. Right, thank you for inviting me to this wonderful conference. So I want to talk to you about the Equity and Inclusivity in Research Funding report, which we published last year. I'm assuming, or I'm hoping that you have had time to look at it, but if you haven't, I'll give you a snippet of what it is. And hopefully you're going to be able to look at it after this. If you're not, you won't be on my Christmas list this year. So I want to sort of cover a bit of the findings from that report. So I don't want to go into too much of the detail. I want to focus on the journey that we've gone through, how we've implemented it, and what we've learned alongside. So sort of moving on from what the issues are, and I think we know what the issues are from what my two colleagues have presented there, but it's about how do we actually make a difference from there. So I'm going to talk to you about the approach that we've taken in Oxford, as well as what we've done on the sector-wide work. And then I'll also ask you to be involved in the project if you can. I'll give you a bit of details, and then if you have questions later on, you can ask those questions. So this report was funded by the Wellcome, as well as the Investors' Own Diversity and Inclusivity funding internally. And we talked to researchers, funders, and we sort of analysed funding schemes. What we're really trying to do here is to understand what the barriers are that people from different backgrounds actually face in accessing research funding. The key there is research funding. I mean, obviously, we all know that to make progress, to get anywhere as a researcher, you do need to get funding. And so we wanted to understand what barriers people were facing there. Now, from what we picked up, I don't think any of what we found is actually surprising in any way. And I think that my colleagues have described some of the things that we also found. What was surprising was how personal these issues were, and that once you start talking to people, it stops being about 31% of BME people didn't get X, Y, and Z. It actually becomes a story about a person and how they actually interact with the system. So some of the things that we actually found as part of this were quite disappointing. So, things like inaccessibility of information, and this was across researchers with disabilities in that sort of sense, where you actually think, I think we've talked enough about disability and how we need to change the environment to support people physically, but actually even some basic websites didn't fit what would be good enough for people with visual impairments and people with certain level of need for support, and that disabled researchers are actually being asked to do extra work just to get the support. So we put it on them to say, if you have this difficulty, you need to do this, instead of just making it really easy for people to have access to that. And then there's also issues around being really vulnerable to bias, and in that sense, people feeling that they didn't really understand how some of these processes work. Composition of panel not really reflecting the differences that you would expect. The scoring systems not taking into account particular issues. And then there's also issues around structural inequality. And on the structural inequality point, I'll just give you an example. You may have, you're a researcher, woman, you've gone away, had 2 years or so time off for break to look after your children. When you come back, the system doesn't wait for you. When you come back, the system still expects you to have that publication list. It still expects you to talk about what you've been doing in the last 2 years. And sort of saying, actually, I've been at home looking after my kids, that's just not good enough. It doesn't cut it. But it's not something that people felt that they have any way of actually putting a plug on that. I mean, I know there's some work that's been going on developing the narrative CV and all of that, but that's a reflection of the issues around how unfair the environment of academia is to people with different backgrounds. And then there's also issues to do with third-party support. For people to access funding, usually they need support from multiple sources. So you need somebody to help you with costing, you need somebody to help you with the writing, somebody needs to proofread it, and somebody needs to, show you how to, structure your thing. And so if you are a researcher from a different background, maybe brand new and international kind of person, you haven't got that network within a university, say as big as Oxford, to know that, there's Grace in accounts who can help me do this, or there's so-and-so who's really good at helping you with, editing. But some people, some researchers, they've got that network, and it just makes it really easy to access. And that network, for most of people from this background, is really hard to put together. And then there's also issue about people feeling that some irrelevant characteristics are used to decide who gets funding. So an example of that, for example, would be, it all looks like it's all on merit. You ask people, put in your proposals, come in, and then we're going to interview and decide who gets it. I come in and maybe I'm on the autistic spectrum, so I'm not really good at, sort of looking at you in the eye when you're interviewing me. I'm not really good at expressing myself. And then that somehow, although it's not really that relevant to the science on my proposal, still somehow does affect who gets to get it and who doesn't. So on the first of it, it looks like, great communication skills. And it looks like it's fair, but is it really fair if you're somebody with that difficulty? If you're somebody with dyslexia, for example, you just find it really hard to sort of, deal with text and material, but your science is absolutely spot on, and you haven't got that network to help you put the paper together in a way that, sort of works the words and stuff. And you get comments like, great paper, shame about the spelling, And so these are things that look like they're really great in assessing which one is the best proposal, but they don't take into account some of the difficulties that people already have. Because if you're saying that to somebody who's on the autistic spectrum, it's because you're not looking at me and therefore you won't get it. You don't really say it that way, but you automatically go for the candidate who's very expressive, very communicative and all that. But for the other candidate, that really is the simple saying, you can't get it because you are who you are, because they can't change. That's something that they can't really change. So it's about, when you are on a panel, reflecting on all of those things and seeing how you can be fair about who actually gets to go through and what's relevant for particular people. And then there's issues to do with lack of clarity and transparency, people feeling that they don't really understand some of the rules to do with particular schemes. Sometimes they just didn't know where those things were because they weren't connected enough. Those things are probably there online, but because they're not connected, they just don't know where to go and look. And then the issue of increased burden, most people feeling that, if you're that one person, that one woman in engineering or physical sciences, somehow you get this burden of needing to represent other women. You're black, you feel this need to represent all black people. And that sort of thing gives you so much pressure to do things that will support that environment in EDI, but actually it's also an additional piece of work that you're doing that other people who don't have that don't need to do. So sort of, those were the sort of issues that came up. But if you read the report, you get a bit more of the detail about what we heard from people. So after publishing this report, obviously the next thing for us was, what's the point of actually coming up with the report, finding all of these issues, both within the University of Oxford and outside in terms of the sector and the funders, if we then don't do anything about it. So we then decided that we're going to do something about it. The report had some recommendations, and so we decided that this piece of work was going to be sort of two arms. One was the internal work that we were going to do within the university, and the other was the work that we're going to do with other people in the sector. So within the university itself, and a big key point of how we're going to do this was to make sure that actually we were engaging people and that we were co-creating the solutions with people. So we did a lot of engagement within the university. So the University of Oxford has got like 40, colleges around it, divisions and departments, and we needed to make sure that we take everybody along with us. What we didn't want to do is to come up with an action plan that people then feel that they have to deliver because their line manager has said you're going to do this. So we wanted to make sure that everybody came along with us. So we consulted extensively across the university, and I've just put the sort of list of committees there that we consulted. So all of the divisions and you know, some of the smaller committees that sit along them, there's about 13 of them, including the unions as well. We did consult the union as well, just to be sure that everybody was on board, both above and below, and to make sure that actually when we start implementing it, everybody knows what we're doing. So that action plan has got 5 objectives. The first one was to create a working group, and that working group is going to be responsible for delivering the whole plan. So that working group is in place. And the second objective is to do a piece of work around data. And the issue of data is an issue that many other universities actually picked up about the difficulties of data. The data around diversity is just so hard to work with. It's either not complete, it's not being collected, or it's being collected the wrong way. So sort of trying to see what can we do about data, because we can't make decisions if we don't understand what's going on. So we're going to do a piece of data just to understand the profile of our researchers, who's getting in across the system, who's falling off and why, and then where the gaps are. And then we're sort of hoping to be able to develop some toolkits for support and what kind of support. And then there's also going to be another piece around leadership, so training and sort of trying to find out everybody who's got something to do with supporting researchers and funding. If they sit on a panel, if they manage a funding, they need to actually be trained in a particular way, so setting the standard about that area. And then the 5th bit of work is the sector-wide work. So the sector-wide work, again, we use the same approach to engage and consult extensively and to make sure that people had input into what it is we're going to do. So at the beginning of it, we thought actually maybe we might come up with a list of what we think needs to happen in the sector. And then we sort of consult the sector and get people to agree to what projects they're going to be involved with. But as we started to do that consultation, and that consultation was in 2 phases, we had one-to-one interviews with funders, and then we had focus group with groups of universities. And we did try as much as possible to invite all sorts of universities, so from Ireland, from Scotland, Wales, England, and all manner of sort of sizes, big, small, post-92, and that sort of combination. So that list gives you about 27 universities who engaged at that point. We've had a few more after this. And I think there's a few from here. Queen's University Belfast, for example, was part of this. And we were trying to talk to people to tell us what it is they're already doing within their institutions, where the gaps would be, what should the priorities be, and how should we go about it. What we really learned from this is that people were very clear about if you're going to do something sector-wide, then you need to think about the differences between the university. You need to think about the fact that every university is independent, they've got their own governance structures, and almost everybody will have some description of a strategy, a plan in some way. So there's some stuff that universities can do on their own, but what you need to focus on is that space in between, the things that can't make progress if we don't work together. So we need to find those issues that if we work together, we make faster progress. And that we need to work on sort of making sure that we have that interface between funders and universities and bringing them together and seeing how we can work that system. So we had that list of universities as well as about 11 funders, Royal Society, Cancer Research UK, the Wellcome has been very key to this project, the British Academy, UKRI, and all of that. So really, really good engagement. So, like I said, we sort of engaged these universities as well as funders. And although we had a plan about how we thought it would come out, but it was really, really interesting to listen to people and how they thought we should do it. There were particular areas that we'd suggested might need to be worked on that people said, no, we don't think you should be doing that. And we were very clear that as we developed it, we kept putting it back to them to say, this is what we've heard you say, this is what we've heard you say, and people kept sort of, in an iterative way, making amendments and following on. So we revised the approach in terms of what the system needs to do, which is we identified some collective areas that people can work together to make a difference. And we also agreed that we need to sort of develop a forum of some form, which would be the structure through which that sector-wide work could happen. And then we put all that together in a forum which happened on the 24th of February 2024. So these institutions came to Oxford on that date, and the aim of that day was to refine all of the outputs that we've heard from people since December to February, and we wanted to agree the sector priorities about what we're going to do in this sector, and we wanted to decide how the forum would be run, and then forge a way forward. Part of it, we also had some practice sharing, and practice sharing we had the British Academy, we had Newcastle University, University of Glasgow. They all shared particular pieces of work that they're doing in here. And people were also very clear that actually what we want here is inclusivity in research funding, not just broad EDI, because there's a lot of work going on in this sector, and we're very clear that we don't want to sort of just go into anything EDI. It has to be focused on funding. So the outputs of this forum were that we've got a public statement that's gone out now to people who engaged in it, where people actually have committed to work together and observe 3 principles. One of those principles was to work on the interface of research, like I said, to observe equity in the process, regardless of the size of the university, but to also share practice. So the way we're seeing this work is that groups of universities might actually work on a particular project led by one university, and if that works, that might then be the new standard that other universities might pick up and then scale up things in that way. Originally, we had identified, I think, about 12 priority areas that we thought people might work on, but then people were able to reprioritize those priorities, and I think we've got about 6 which people at that point agreed with. But some of the areas that they were looking at is having, a map of available support, mapping the system and trying to understand what's going on. Demand management was a big issue. Data in particular was also a big issue. Mapping the funding process and that long. So at the moment, we have this public statement out that participants are now signing up and endorsing. And then, we've sent all of those documents out, and maybe in 2 or 3 weeks, we'll be publishing the report itself. We'll be publishing a blog, and then the forum itself has been set. People have agreed what the terms of references for that forum would be, and then maybe in 4 or 6 weeks' time, we'll probably be convening the first forum for people. So we've got some investors who've put themselves up to say, we're going to be the lead for that. So like Birmingham is going to lead on demand management, and some other investors have put themselves up to lead on particular projects. So as it stands, we are still appealing to people to join us on this journey. We're still asking people to, come in forward if they're doing interesting projects in this area that can be part of that list of 6. That's absolutely fine if they're leading, or they can contribute, they can join. And if you want to join, you want to be part of this, all you need to do is just send me an email. But across all of this, all we're saying as well is that this is not just doing something for the sake of it, or because, there's research culture, and research culture is the in thing now. What we're saying is actually this is more than that. And we're not doing this just because it's nice, it's fair, it's equitable. It's good to be nice and fair and equitable, but actually a big part of this as well is about talent management. We are working in a different world now, and where before everybody would have wanted to come to Oxford and go somewhere else, the world is bigger now. People have got so many options of where they can take their talent, and so a big part of this is actually making sure that we don't lose people simply because we put barriers in front of them that they need not have face those barriers. Karen did explain about the changes along in terms of gender in higher education. And, if you look at medicine, for example, maybe 50, 60 years from now, your doctor was likely to be white and middle class, but today you can't imagine medicine just having men in there. But you can also appreciate what it meant to not have women in medicine. And I think it's the same thing. If we have groups of people that are dropping off the research sector simply because they didn't look a particular way or they didn't have a particular skill, then actually we're losing research, and that's not good for research, and that's one of the drivers of this work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thandiwe, for that very insightful input into the report. So our final speaker this afternoon then is Professor Rachael Cowen, and Rachael comes from the University of Manchester. So Rachael is a Professor of Inclusive Researcher and Academic Development and University Academic Lead for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, Gender and Sexual Orientation. She has over 30 years experience as a cancer researcher, organisational developer and equalities champion leading on institutional gender strategy, policy and practice development. She has worked with a network of inspirational colleagues to support academic excellence within a culture that values diversity and prioritises equity of opportunity, reward and recognition. Rachael is a panel chair for the transformed Athena Swan Charter and a principal fellow of the Higher Education Academy Advance HE. She is also a mentor, coach and champion for diverse and inclusive leadership development, supporting the career advancement of colleagues across the university sector. Rachael's talk this afternoon is on reflection on gender equality and challenges for academic careers. Thank you, Rachael.
Thank you so much, Emir, and thank you to the organising team for allowing me to come to the beautiful Waterford. It's been brilliant so far, and great to be part of this launch of this really inspiring network. So I'm Rachael Cowen, my pronouns are she, her, hers, and it really was really interesting for me to reflect on the gender equality journey at the University of Manchester. So we are 200 years old as an institution this year. We were formed in 1824. And for 60 years, the first 60 years of our establishment, there were no women within our institution. So it wasn't until the late 1880s when women were allowed into the institution, but they were segregated from men. They couldn't graduate. In fact, it wasn't really till the early 1900s that women could graduate from the University of Manchester. And one of our notable alumni, we're really proud to say, was Christabel Pankhurst, a leading suffragette. It wasn't till 1934 that we had our first female professor, Professor Mildred Pope, in Romantic Languages. And we didn't have our first and only female Vice-Chancellor and our current Vice-Chancellor, Dame Professor Nancy Rothwell, until 2010. And that's really when our gender equality Athena Swan journey started within the institution. And it was not until 2019 that we had our first black woman professor, Professor Dawn Edge, and I job share with Dawn. I lead on gender and sexual orientation, and my inspiring colleague Dawn leads on race and religion equality. Through Athena Swan, working with wonderful colleagues like Dawn and Jackie Carter, who leads on disability, we have been recognised for our work towards equality through our Silver Athena Swan, which we got in January of this year, our Race Equality Silver Award, which we got in October last year, and again this year we've been awarded our Disability Confident Leader Employer, and we're just waiting, fingers crossed, that we will be still in the top 30 for our Stonewall LGBTQ plus inclusivity. But what difference has Athena Swan made at Manchester? So we, looking at our data, so we're really, have a good, thorough understanding of our staff and student pipeline data across all disciplines. But at institutional level, we have overrepresentation of women within our undergraduate population and parity at postgraduate level. Similarly, within our senior professional services, we have near parity, and for the first time within our university senior leadership team, we have parity across males and females. But when we look again at the highest level of the academic pipeline, at our professoriate, we are still only at 30%, very jealous of the 34% at Queen's. So we are making some progress, but that progress has been slow and hard won. You can see, we're slowly closing that gender pay gap, but we're actually seeing our race and disability gaps widening. So I was asked to reflect on some of the things that are working for us, some of the things that we think have had and know through our evaluation have had impact. So we've really had a strong focus on working towards an inclusive campus and environment. We're really raising the visibility of those incredibly inspiring and diverse women and ethnic minorities and disabled researchers and academics and professional services within our community. We've really invested in vibrant staff and student networks. Here you can see our wonderful wall of women, and we have a 500 strong Women at Manchester network, as well as our really vibrant and active All Our Allies network. We've also been providing extensive training around active bystander and really raising the visibility of our zero tolerance of bullying and harassment. And we've significantly invested in our report and support systems. We led the sector in terms of the establishment of that online confidential reporting system. And we've also led on an annual calendar of diverse events, really bringing seminars, education, awareness, and celebrating the diversity of our community. And then initiatives and significant financial investment, for example, in our free period products across all toilets within buildings on our central campus. We've also significantly invested in the promotion and championing of diverse women leaders. So I'm the University Aurora champion for Manchester. We've had over 150 women over the last 10 years who've been through that programme. And we know the significant individual difference that makes to those women. We've been tracking their careers, both the careers of the professional services Aurorans and also the academic Aurorans. And we see, over 50% being promoted, including up to senior roles. We've also been looking at that cohort and realising that actually the majority of the women on Aurora through our recruitment processes have been white. So we have been specifically diversifying our recruitment approaches, bringing in inclusive recruitment practices there, and also investing in wider leadership development schemes. So we were really privileged, Dawn and myself, to be part of the design team with the Women in Higher Education Network for the really groundbreaking 100 Black Women Professors Now programme. So now in its third year, that is a series of accelerator programmes for Black women within the academy, both for PGR, early career and mid-career level, to really address the stark underrepresentation of Black women academics. So currently in the UK, we only have 66 Black women academics, not Manchester, but across the whole of the UK. What we're also finding through, working with and mentoring and supporting our women leaders is actually they're calling for culture change. They want to be able to bring their authentic selves as leaders into the academic space. And so, we are working very much with them to really raise visibility of some of the barriers that they're experiencing, and to really think about how we can work and fix the system rather than always supporting women to be able to thrive in the current culture. We want to effect culture change so that everybody can survive going forward in the future. We've also been interrogating our data in terms of who has access to research experiences, be it through undergraduate research internships or PhD scholarships or early career fellowships. And where we are seeing inequalities play out, both in terms of underrepresentation of access or bias in terms of who's awarded funding, we are putting in positive action targeted support. So we have put in place targeted EDI research internships for underrepresented groups, scholarships specifically at the PhD stage for Black, Asian and minority ethnic researchers, and also post-PhD EDI awards to really bridge the gap between PhD research and postdoctoral fellowships. We've also put in place targeted EDI Pereira fellowships. These were named after Catherine Pereira, who was the academic who started our gender equality work at Manchester. And picking up on the point that was made earlier around the impact of career breaks, notably maternity, paternity and adoption leave, we have put in place a returners scheme that's pump prime funding for that individual when they come back after extended leave so that they can get their research back on track and ensure that they don't take that research hit because of that extended break. So we're continuing to look at our data throughout this pipeline, and where we need to, we will take positive action. We've also been working really hard to educate our whole community and really take EDI from the domain and work and activity of people like me or the EDI team with an institution to make it everybody's responsibility. So I've led a campaign at Manchester called Inclusive Manchester. I've created undergraduate education, so we have a credit-bearing course for our undergraduate students. It's also sent to all offer holders at the university called EDI, Your Role in Shaping a Fairer World. So it connects our students with the current data around EDI, the legislation across EDI in education, the workplace, research and innovation, health and social care, but importantly, it asks them to think about the role that they have in creating a fairer future world and what they can do as future inclusive leaders. We've also been taking this same education to our leaders and managers within our staff community as well. Because if you look at models of inclusive organisations, and we see an example on the screen here taken from the Deloitte model of inclusive leaders, it's by engaging leaders and managers, the people that shape that local culture, that you really can affect true inclusive culture change. So, and move from that programme level compliance approach that EDI has really suffered from over the last many years. So we are embedding a leadership framework with role model for inclusion at its heart, and we are we have a whole programme of embedded EDI training within our leadership and management programmes. We're also looking at policy to really support inclusivity, very similar to Queen's, looking at flexible working, hybrid working by default from day one for all grades, roles and areas, including in the context of research. So those are some of the things that we think are having an impact, things that are going well for us. But we really must acknowledge that we have to go much further and faster. And at the current pace of change, we're making less than 1% progress annually towards gender parity at professor level. And the progress with respect to other protected characteristics is much slower. It's also much slower on the research pathway. So females, for example, remain underrepresented on teaching and research contracts in academia compared to the parity that we see within research contracts and the overrepresentation of women in teaching contracts. And if you think about where the power lies in a research-intensive Russell Group institution like Manchester, it's from the people who are involved in research and leading research. And similarly, if you think about contracts of employment, and where we're seeing women well represented, that's in areas where there are a majority fixed-term contracts, insecurity in terms of contracts. So, and that's predominantly being experienced by women and minorities. So there's much more that we need to do. We've heard throughout this session that inequalities are baked into our systems, particularly in the research and innovation ecosystem, be it policy, practice or culture. And actually, there is some resistance in the system, and I think it's definitely we should say that. There is a real belief that we recruit, we award, we promote, we support in a meritocratic and equitable way, and this is just not true. The myth of meritocracy is hard to shift, but it's something that we all need to work collectively to do. And the burden of this should not fall on women and minorities, has been the norm up to this point. So, it really is wonderful to see the launch of a network like this. I'm hoping that we can come together with, an analogous network that I'm part of within the UK, because it is really only through that collective sector-wide accountability, working together through the networks with our funders, that we can all together support each other and take meaningful action.